I want to continue on the idea of component first architecture to talk about how, as developers, we can do a better job of just staying in our lane or staying in our zone. What are your blockers? What harshes your mellow? What takes you out of the zone when you're writing code? Um, for me, it's context switching. Almost all of us have difficulty in changing context. Some days, if I'm in the zone, I'm coding and I get interrupted for a meeting, it's like I'm never getting back. I'm sort of shot for the day. Um, we should avoid that as much as possible, depending on how much control you have over your schedule and whether or not emergencies arise. However, these context shifts also happen while we're coding. You can feel it, you can sensitize yourself to it. A really interesting thing that is, if you allow yourself to be tuned into those as opposed to just grinding through, muscling through it, you can often lead to a better overall software architecture. As an example, even though it's a simple one, in that last video I was creating components and I noticed a context switch as I was recording the video. I had created a little demo component and then decided to add some styling to it. I wasn't particularly happy with the styling I did add. I rarely am, and when I do it, and I felt like we needed it. So for me, this specific example, styling, is actually a huge trap. If I start hyper focusing on that, I'll never emerge. It'll never look good and I'll never emerge. I'll have a half-assed styled component or that doesn't actually work. So what I want to suggest is that you train yourself to pay attention to those kind of blockers like that. Cordon your work off and stay focused in your zone. Try to get the thing to work first. So while I'm a much better coder than I am a graphic designer, I can even do a halfway decent UI UX thing if I'm allowed to fully immerse myself in that work. But if I'm switching back and forth between how it works and how it looks, it's a real killer for me, a real productivity stopper. Good frameworks and libraries, along with our coding skills, promote this kind of specialized work to happen. So in Angular, which is what we're working with now, components allow us to focus in on a small piece of screen real estate, oblivious to any of the other functionality around it. Things like pipes allow us to focus in on the presentation of data, variables, outside the context in which it's presented. Directives allow us to augment and specialize things like HTML elements. So in this video, I'm going to show you my approach to staying in my lane when I'm wearing the component developer hat, and how we can use Angular directives to allow us to focus in on more general presentational concerns. So I'm going to jump back into the code here and take a look at what we were doing last time in this counter component. So I've started up my application. Let's see what this thing looks like. So I had roughed out this little application using an NX workspace, couple routes, home and about, not much there, but we created a feature that was a demonstration of the Redux counter stuff here. And if I look at the component, you can see my first run through this, I didn't put any styling on it at all. It basically looked like this. So we'll just delete the class attributes on this. And not super impressive. I think I felt a little bit like, is this a real video if it's going to look like this? And I kind of betrayed one of my practices, which is, frankly, just don't worry about it too much. Later on in videos, we'll do some things like component testing and we'll use Cypress, etc. I don't really worry too much about what the component looks like when I'm working at that level. Now, those buttons, this is greenfield development. We don't often get to do this, but these buttons, they're just HTML elements here. And but I can anticipate that things like buttons within our application are going to have or be part of our overall design system. If you're hiring me to do coding for you, you're probably better off hiring somebody with experience building design systems. But the practice here is to abstract these things into reusable things. Now, one approach to doing that, of course, is to create Angular components for these things. The problem with components is if we decided to create our own button component, you eventually over time have to have enough inputs and enough outputs on that component where you're basically creating just a facade over the whole HTML element of type button. Directives, on the other hand, let us decorate HTML elements with additional functionality. So what I'm going to do back in the code here is I'm just going to say both of these buttons are in the same category. So right now they have no styling. We'll come back and talk about the span in a bit, but both of these buttons, I'm going to give them a name. So HTUI button. And those are just attributes added to this. I'm not going to get in trouble for that. As a matter of fact, if I look in my developer tools, they're kind of just ignored. I'm not getting any errors or warnings on my console. Angular pretty much just ignores those. So what we're going to want is a little bit of code that notices those and then applies some basic styling to this. On the span, I could do maybe UI a label, right? Just kind of put some markers down on what these things represent above and beyond the HTML elements. So these aren't just buttons, but these are specific buttons. They're UI buttons from within this project, the Hypertheory project. This is a label, etc., etc. In my Cypress test, I may write a test just to verify that these buttons have these attributes and this span has this attribute. But one of the things about styling is it's shifty, it changes. We have things like, oh, we want dark mode now, or the latest, greatest, everything's turning purple, dark mode. We want to change that kind of stuff. And I like to test that kind of thing separately. Again, we'll cover that in later videos. So what I'm going to do, assuming this is good, you know, I've done my work, I would have a set of tests. I'm doing manual testing here that allow me to increment and decrement the button. What I would do then is put on my designer hat. You know, I might put on a beret, light a clove cigarette, put on some, you know, mid-century jazz music, and start thinking about what these things should look like. And I'm going to declare these actually in a library because they would be useful throughout my application, multiple features, etc. So I'm going to generate a library. We'll use the JavaScript, really TypeScript library generator from NX here. And I'm going to give this the name of maybe core UI, and our import path will be UI. And go ahead and run that. So NX is going to create a new library for me in that library. So if I look inside the libs folder here, we had our feature from the last video. Here's core UI. In the source lib folder, they have a spec and a UI file. There's nothing of value in there. I'm just going to delete both of those things. And for the time being, not export anything from this library. In that lib folder, I'm going to create a button directive. And I don't have a snippet set up for this, but these are classes with the directive. I'm going to import from Angular core directive. And if I open up that counter component to the side here, HTUI button, that's going to become the selector for that. We'll talk a little bit more about refining these, but it kind of picked up that's what I want, this HTUI button. The square brackets, the selector syntax here is based on CSS selector. So square brackets thing that say this can be applied to any old element with the attribute of HTUI button. We'll talk about some options there as we go along. I'm going to make this standalone. Otherwise, it would have to be part of a module. We'll just direct this, bring this directly into our component for our counter component or anywhere else in our application, and we might want that. In the constructor for this there are actually two different kinds of directives in Angular. There are these directives, just kind of standard directives, and what are called structural directives. Perhaps in a later video, we'll look at structural directives. Structural directives take a template, and they can use the element they're applied to as the template by prefixing the name of the directive with an asterisk. So like ng if or ng switch, etc. But this will just be a straight ahead directive applied to a single component. So on the constructor, I'm going to get a reference to the element this is applied to as an element ref. And that element ref, if you look at the type of this, if I hover over that, it assumes it's any kind of element at all. I like to give it at least a little bit, and we'll talk about this more later, little more type information. So HTML element, because then we'll get better IntelliSense code completion, etc. with these things. We could do inside the constructor here a little bit of work on that element, and sometimes I'll do this in the constructor, sometimes I'll do it in ng on init. We're not really going to be talking to any outside data or something, so I think the constructor would be fine with this. So probably could even get rid of the private thing for now. Let's not expose it more than we need to. So within the constructor, I could access that element. So L dot, I want to get a reference to the native element here. So the native element is going to be of type HTML element. You can see this here. And I'm going to cache that. So const the element equals L native element, because I'm going to do lots of things with this. And then the element, I'm going to get to its class list. These are just native DOM manipulation techniques. You could find documentation about this on MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, or wherever. And I'm just going to add in one of the classes I had on there already, which was BTN. Remember, this stuff comes from Daisy UI. So what that means now, if I refresh this application, and it finds those elements, it's going to apply this. Now, it's still not being applied because these aren't known about yet. So in the index for this library, this new little core UI library I created here, I'm going to export that. So lib, button directive, and then in this component, in my imports, I'm going to bring that in and import it from UI. I just called that UI there. All right, so the button directive is imported, and if I look at the HTML now and refresh here, every once in a while you have to restart the server. This is because we're using Tailwind, so I'm just going to shut down my little server and start up ngserve again. You can see in the output here, Daisy UI, 29 themes, utilities, etc., etc. It's figuring out what it needs to include based on that. So we have our buttons. They're not quite styled the way we had them before. If you recall, I think this one was a red color and this one was a green color. So we could, in that component, that directive, I'm sorry, you can add multiple classes. So button success, both of them are green, but we actually want to vary it a bit on for each button. And BTN might be the default state for these, that if we use that, we want to have a default state for any button that has that on it. But we also want to, I know in this example, we have two different variants that we're going to use, sometimes called intents. We'll use the term variant, which was the orangish color and the green color. Now, we don't want to use orange, green, etc. Because one of the big benefits of doing this is we're decoupling our code from the actual presentation concerns, how it looks. So what we'll do is create some variants. And one way to do this, I'm only going to create a couple on this one, is a little TypeScript wizardry. I'm going to do maybe UI variants. And I know we're going to need two different ones. So there's primary, and from the Daisy UI, that's button primary. There's also warning, and that's button warning. And I'm going to add the handy as const directive here, and then create a little type for this. So type UI variants. Actually, key of type of UI variants. And that will actually create a data type for our input on this. So back on my directive, I'm going to use an input, import that, and I'm going to call it variant, and whatever the UI variants are here. And I'm not going to have a default for this, so I'm going to say that's nullable. It may or may not exist, but what that means now is in the component I can specify the variant. So this might be a primary, and actually I think this one was a warning, and this variant was primary. So now what I'm going to do, we could be a little more optimized with this. Let's get it done though. If this dot variant, the element, I'm going to look in our little constant list of UI variants. When we use this as const thing, you can see the data type here means that these are a map to a specific value, whereas UI variants here are a TypeScript union type of just the keys of the type of UI variant. So primary warning. And what that means is if I put a bad value over here, I should get a compile failure, right? Because that is not a allowed variant. The type primary is not assignable to type primary, warning, or undefined. So a little bit of type checking on that side. And then I can apply the variant if there is a variant. So if you look, they're not actually being applied here. The button is, but this is not. Once we start conditionally adding things here, that's a good time to say, okay, let's do this on init. So we'll import this, and in our ng on init, right before it's showtime and Angular has had the time to read those values, duplicate a little bit of this code here. And let's see what we get. So this button has obviously some coloring. The nice thing to do is to look at, inspect the DOM here. And, oh, I see I spelt button wrong here. That was not intentional. And primary is correct. So down in my type, BTN, warning. And now they both look pretty decent. Those are the two different variants we have, and that's probably enough for this. We could on the selector, so going back to the selectors here a little bit, we could say that this can only be applied to a button. Again, just knowing some basic CSS selectors is really helpful for this, and that will continue to work. But if we had something like a hyperlink, and I wanted to make this an HTUI button as well with the variant of primary, sure, go to about here. Notice it's going to leave out that styling. That selector did not match that element. Um, I'm pretty okay with this styling being applied to any type of button-like UI affordance. We could leave it the way it was by taking this out, or I could say this is good for either a button or a hyperlink. So there's my hyperlink that's styled that way. If I wanted to, because what I had done is a and button. Now this is a little bit of a problem because if I get rid of HTUI button here, it's still getting that styling. So you can have multiple selectors. So I want this to match any hyperlink that is UI button or any button that is UI button. So the comma is a combinator that says or. And now that's not going to match until I decide to show it as a button. And I could change maybe accent, right? That's not a proper variant, but we could add that to our types. Like that. And we get that secondary color. Now, one of the things you may notice if you right click and do the inspect on here is that the tools in Edge or Google Chrome are going to tell you some issues with your application. Buttons should always have a type attribute set on them. And the type should either be button, reset, or submit. And that's good information. As a developer, I could go through on each one of these buttons and add a type equals submit. But we could also say, what, if it's a button element, if this type of element is a button and it doesn't have a type, we're just going to default to type of button. Just use as an example of how having this all in one directive, you can actually start to do some pretty interesting things with this. So I could say what I want inside this ng on init is something that if the element doesn't have a type attribute and it is a button, then add the type attribute of button, something like that. So if, let's see, is missing type attribute, the element, and it is a button, the element, I'm going to set this on here. Now these two little methods don't actually exist yet. I just didn't want to do all that work, so I could create a couple little functions here. So function is missing type attribute. GitHub Copilot kind of did that work for me. We could create our other one. And the element tag name. This is trying to do it to lowercase, but I think the tag name property is always normalized to uppercase. So if it's a button. So now if we inspect one of these elements, we can see the warning's gone because they do have type button. I might want to, and this is where the next video we're going to talk about testing. I might want to do a little bit of manual testing here. If I look at the component, again, our little counter component, and I add a type attribute, so maybe type equals reset. I'm going to make sure that doesn't get overwritten, so there's type reset. And if I open up my developer tools, you can see its type is reset. Hopefully you found this useful. To review what we've done here, I wanted to show that by staying focused, you can begin to take advantage of the facilities in your library or framework for separating concerns. When you get sidetracked by different concerns than what you are working on, that's a sign that your code is getting too complex. In this little demo application, we had a component that was mixing behavior with some business concerns with presentation concerns. Our component was a complex of behaviors and low-level presentation concerns. So we refactored this by first naming the concern. As programmers, we're like magicians. We can just make stuff up and then make it kind of real. I decided that the buttons on this component had some similarities. And by declaring them, giving them a name as HTUI buttons, we posited the future existence of something that could combine the things those buttons had in common. When we were ready, I could address those concerns. We did this through creating a library with a directive. The directive attached itself to the elements with that name, HTUI button, and handled some cross-cutting concerns. This was a basic example. We handled some styling, exposing some variants, as well as a little bit of low-level DOM manipulation to make sure that our application met accessibility requirements. This style of programming really comes together when we start doing testing. We'll do that in a future video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. I don't often hit the bell for notifications thing, but if you're inspired, go right ahead. What I would prefer are some comments, criticism, and maybe some suggestions about things that I could add here that you would find helpful. In our next video, we'll do some work with testing both the components and the directives. We'll do it at a high level using Cypress. Once again, thanks for watching.